This is your Gaza War Sit Rep Day 122. We are doing a military analysis of the Gaza War that does not disdain Arab military capabilities and understands guerrilla warfare. And I should say conventional warfare, because today we're going to talk about a previous war, a very important war to understand in the military scheme and the psychological scheme of trying to analyze the current war that Israel is in against the Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and Iranians and most of its neighbors, unless those neighbors have a direct agreement with the United States, like Egypt and Jordan. So first, though, as always, we do the headlines. I want to This is an attritional phase that we're in. We're in an attritional phase where the reports that I'm giving you are of incremental destruction of Israeli equipment and deaths of Israeli soldiers in Khan Yunis and in Gaza City. Reports from the Palestinian resistance factions about this question. There's a Israeli former chief of staff, Aviv Koshavi, who says, "We are losing vast areas of our lands in the north and south. The state of Israel is shrinking and everyone is being squeezed into the Gush Dan area." I saw a report, can't confirm, but I saw a report that there on a single day, there were thousands. I saw the number 30,000 people leaving Israel from the main airport there. So the Israeli prime minister apparently has also revised. He used to say that this conflict would go on for years, and now he's revised it to say that it's going to go on for months. It has gone on for months, and they're saying it's going to go on for months. So that's interesting. I also saw the ceasefire text. If you saw my last report, my last video, I was talking about the little game that was played by Qatar along with Israel of falsely announcing that Hamas had tentatively accepted a deal. I actually saw the text of the proposal that was sent to Hamas, and it was basically like Israel said, "Hey, we don't like how this war is going, so here's how we would like for you, Hamas, to surrender." That was what they were offering. They were saying, "We'll give you a pause of 45 days so you can give us all our prisoners back, at which point we'll resume bombing." There's absolutely no way. And if you understand war aims, right? People go to war. They don't go to war. Nobody goes to war to try to win a ceasefire. They go to war for certain war aims. And Hamas was very clear about what their aims were. They want an end to the siege. They want all their prisoners released. They want guarantees for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Israel wants to destroy and rebuild a temple on the site of it, the way that India built a temple on the site of an ancient mosque, the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. So that's like the paradigm for destroying a mosque and building whatever was supposedly there before, which is the formula that Israel hopes to follow. So the war aims, I think, especially in the case of the most I guess urgent war aim would be an end to the siege. There's no reconstruction. There's no humanitarian aid while Israel controls entry and exit into Gaza. That has to end. That has to end in a sustainable way where it isn't Israel that is deciding what and who goes in and out of Gaza. And I don't see the war ending until that ends. That was not always the case. It's not a fact of nature. Israel does not have to control every movement of every Palestinian person. It wasn't always the case. It does not have to be the case. It is a fact of several decades, and it can change. Now, there are other things that the leaders of the Palestinian resistance have said can be negotiated, right? The right of return, land, these questions are longer questions that can be negotiated, but an end to the aggression and an end to the siege, I don't see I see the war going on as long as those things continue. So some any yeah, there's one other little bit of there's a little bit of another quote from an Israeli official, which is the Minister of Finance of Israel. He said something like, settlements create security and settlers are the security belt for the state of Israel. When you think of that quote in the context of the discussion that, say, someone like Salman Abu Sitta of the Palestine Lands Institute, I think it's called, the Palestine Land, the map I showed in a couple of sit reps ago of where he has these detailed ideas of how to implement the right of return. And the Gaza specifically, there's agricultural land in the south that is very sparsely populated by these villages that are designed to envelop Gaza. So they're fortified villages designed to envelop Gaza, which is why they're called the Gaza envelope. And then they're all over these small communities that are put there and subsidized there in order to, for the one purpose of preventing the Palestinians from returning to their land. That's the idea. And that's what settlements are for. That's what settlements are about. And this is another reason I think a lot of people don't understand what's often called settler colonialism. There's an idea that they want the land without the people. You've probably heard this many different times. And I don't think that's entirely right. I actually think that settler colonialism is an obsession with the native people. It's an obsession with the indigenous people. So they'll follow them around. Wherever they expel them to, they want to control them still. They want to control their lives still. There's no stopping once you have this empty great land. And then you confine indigenous people to smaller and smaller territories. You still have to control them. You still have to see what they're doing. You still have to steal their cultural artifacts and steal their, steal their hopes and dreams and pretend that their dances are yours and their music is yours. All of these things, their oranges, their olives, all of these things are part of settler colonialism. It's not about land. It's not about empty land. It's about trying to steal the identity of indigenous people. It's like a talented Mr. Ripley kind of dynamic. It's a psychological effect that it has. And it really is destabilizing psychologically, I think. And that's why there's so much torture. You've probably all seen these even new horrific lows, the torture of a man who's handcuffed to a chair. You've probably seen videos being circulated. We've discovered that some of these channels of Israelis murdering Palestinian civilians and torturing them for pleasure, are circulating for pleasure, these videos on Telegram channels of hundreds of thousands of people. And they're run by the Israeli army. They're not run on a grassroots. I mean, some of them are grassroots too, but they're run by the Israeli army. There's a kind of a lack of understanding that any of this is wrong. There's a kind of a loss of the sense of right from wrong. And so when it goes beyond the community that's enjoying these images, there's a bit of a surprise, like, oh, what was wrong with this? I don't get it. So all of these things are part of settler colonialism. And the thing the finance minister said is not wrong in a sense. Settlers don't create security, but settlers are key to the state of Israel because it's the settlers and the settlements and the constant positioning of these fortified bases around the indigenous people that constitute the whole project. And that's the way to deny them the means of survival. And you deny them the means of survival to better control them. It's a project of control. It's a project of obsessive control and violence, and it causes real real unbalance. And so that is, I think, what Israelis have been saying. One other thing I saw, and I'll show you it on Arya's feed, Aryjeay, and it's a whole news piece of the Israeli Minister of Defense or War, whatever they call it. He went to the U.S. envoy and made a series of requests for what they want from Hezbollah. So they said, okay, America, please get Hezbollah to move away from the borders, to diminish their ability to launch anti-tank missiles, and get a ceasefire agreements and conditions from Hezbollah, which is, again, they don't want a ceasefire, they want to surrender. But why are you asking America for these things? How can America deliver these things? Only Hezbollah can deliver these things. And Hezbollah has said explicitly that they will deliver these things when the aggression on Gaza stops. So that what they want is for all of these things to happen without the aggression on Gaza stopping. Likewise, the ceasefire proposal. So when you think of settler colonialism, don't think of wanting an empty land. What's going on there is it's a reactive, negative kind of attitude. So you think of the war aims of the Palestinian resistance, which are primarily about control of their own lives and control ultimately of their land, the right to return to the homes that they were thrown out of, and the right to freedom of movement that everyone enjoys. And when you think of the Israeli war aims for this war, they're basically just to prevent that. We want to prevent that. We want to return to the situation where we control where Palestinians go, we control what they do, and we control every little detail of their lives. And we watch them from our cameras, we watch them from our towers, we decide whether they go through this turnstile or not. We go into their communities, we spy on them, we get them to snitch on each other, we get them to kill each other as informants. We do all these operations. We constant obsessive control. And that's what Israel's war aim is. And so the question becomes, what is Israel willing to sacrifice? And what is Israel willing to get the United States to sacrifice and the entire West to sacrifice in order to prevent Palestinians from having these freedoms? Turns out it's quite a lot, which I guess can take us to the attrition part of the report. So there's a report from, I think, 2 days ago that came from Abu Obaida of the Qassam brigades, the Hamas armed wing, and they said they've completely or partially destroyed 43 military vehicles. You also heard a couple of sit-reps ago about targeting and eliminating 15 soldiers from point blank range, dozens of casualties in 17 different operations, seizing drones. That's just the biggest faction. Others have other reports. Hezbollah released an infographic where they said they've targeted 24 Merkava tanks, 28 APCs, 20 leadership rank positions, destroyed 2 military factories, 2 Iron Dome platforms, more than 2,000 casualties, 26 operations per day. So that's substantial. The same things, similar things are happening with the other brigades operations, destroying Merkava tanks, destroying bulldozers. Meanwhile, on the Iraq front, we heard that one of the biggest armed group, Kata'ib Hezbollah, said they were suspending operations against US targets. The US hit 85 different locations. They did another round of bombing. They've been bombing Hodeidah today, Yemen's port of Hodeidah. So they're bombing Yemen. Yemen is continuing to attack US and UK ships and shipping in the Red Sea, as well as Iraq. The Iraqi resistance is also attacking and hitting the Israeli port of Eilat. So all of these continue to go, and I do plan to do a little tally to the extent that I can of the vehicles destroyed in the month of January, similarly to what I did for December, just to try to gather a set of numbers about the amount of military equipment material destroyed, Israeli equipment destroyed in the month of January. And the reason I want to do these is because I'm pretty sure that the resistance is destroying it at a faster rate than Israel can keep up. And if that's right, that's how a war of attrition goes. And that's how a war of attrition ends, is when one side or the other is depleted. Now, because you've been following the humanitarian situation, that the West is fully on board with trying to starve the Palestinian population by cutting funding to UNRWA, essentially at the same time as the International Court of Justice ruling came down, saying, ordering emergency measures, provisional measures, that Israel take provisional measures to prevent genocide from happening. So the whole West, Canada, France, etc., all accelerated genocide as fast as they could. And the Israelis, as you again know, did a whole bunch of really high-profile atrocities, filmed them proudly for the cameras to show that they don't care about this ruling and they don't abide by international law. And the US pledged similarly to protect them no matter what. History is written by the victors. The law is determined by the victors and the powerful. And so that takes us to our discussion of the 1967 war. So when you hear things like history is written by the victors, when you hear things like the powerful do what they want and the victims accept the powerless accept what they must, there's always this notion of Israel is the powerful one. Israel is the one that can dictate because Israel is mighty. And why is Israel mighty? Does Israel have a phenomenal domestic industrial base? No, they're a small country of several million, most of whom are engaged militarily in police and occupation operations, torturing and imprisoning a civilian population. So it's not their military industrial complex, although there's a lot of hype about it. The military industrial complex of Israel is a woven into the military industrial complex of the US. And so there's a certain branch element to this base. Sure, battle tested, they claim, really occupation tested technology. And so it's not the industrial base. It's not the size of the population. It's not a very big population. So what is it? What is this? Why is Israel the powerful, seen as this powerful military? It all is about 1967. It is about this stunning victory of David versus Goliath, of Israel, this small country without an extensive industrial base, with weapons supplied by the West, against the giant Egyptian military and Syria, against an alliance of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. All these militaries bigger than Israel's. And so it's this amazing victory. And that victory is what made them the victors that get to write the history. That victory is the victory that makes them the powerful. They get to decide which laws they follow and which laws they don't. And we will talk at some point about 1948 and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's a story I'm sure you listeners know quite a bit about. But we'll go through Ilan Pape's book and some of the other ones for sure at some point in these sit reps. But today I want to just talk a bit about I want to do a first installment on 1967 and what about it is so special. And 1967 made all these books of doctrine get rewritten. Everything in the history of war gets rewritten because of this war. And prior to this war, Israel had fought against Egypt in 1956, and it was kind of stopped. They were on their way, with Britain and France and Israel were on their way to taking over the Suez Canal and taking Nasser down. And the United Nations peacekeeping was invented by Canada to help America and Britain and France and Israel all get along again. And Lester B. Pearson helped bridge this divide between these Western imperialists by creating these UN peacekeepers. And so the Americans decided they didn't want this. They wanted to be the ones who would determine what would happen in the Middle East, and they wanted to be the ones who would take over patronage of Israel. So they called that war off, and they inserted themselves into the Middle East conflict at that point. So in 1967, this is round two. This is Israel's revenge. And Israel also wanted to get a lot done before the UN. Everybody assumed, Nasser also in Egypt assumed, that the United Nations was going to come and impose a ceasefire. And so what can we get before a ceasefire is imposed? That's the question on both sides, actually. And so Israel rewrote all of its military doctrine in the light of this 1967 victory. So they created this victory doctrine, which they've believed in ever since. The victory doctrine says we fight short wars that are decisive, and we fight them on enemy territory. We use intelligence superiority. We use our destructive firepower. And this is not a doctrine. That's what was so striking to me. I thought, who doesn't want to fight on enemy territory? Who doesn't want to fight short wars? Who wants to fight long wars on their own territory that are not decisive? Nobody. If you have the ability to do those things, of course that's what you want. But you don't. It's a question of whether you have those abilities or not. And Israel did in 1967, but not since. And that is what we're all, I guess, living with, or we're all kind of trying to come to grips with, which is that this victory in 1967 created a whole configuration in the region which everybody still kind of believes to be the case, except the resistance axis does not believe it's the case. Hezbollah does not believe it's the case. Hamas and the Palestinian resistance factions do not believe that it's the case anymore. And that's what's being tested. That's what's being broken, is that 1967 paradigm. Now, there's political consequences too, international consequences. Chomsky and Finkelstein have both argued that a lot of pro-Israel sentiment, politics throughout the West, even including the way that World War II is interpreted and understood, is post 1967. So pre 1967, there wasn't a lot of respect for Israel. There was a lot more anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and anti-Israel sentiment. And after 1967, there was this incredible respect for Israel. Chomsky's, to paraphrase Chomsky, it's sort of like Israel is really able to stick it to these third world countries, to these uppity Arab nationalists, and that's what deserves our praise. And that's like there's a book I really got a lot out of by a journalist, Judy Reaver. It's about another conflict. It's about Rwanda. And Judy Reaver was trying to explain why the West has so much unconditional support of the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, despite Rwanda under Kagame committing huge massacres of thousands of refugees at a time and attacking the Congo and killing potentially millions of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, plundering their natural resources, and ruling with the real iron fist, coming into conflict with Uganda, interfering in Burundi, a whole list of crimes, like really horrific crimes, assassinations, an international assassination program, killing people in Kenya, South Africa. So despite all this, the West loves Kagame. And she said, and she used this title, she said, it's as if the West is doing this in praise of blood. That's the name of her book. It's like the West has this specific love of regimes and leaders who are capable of inflicting this immense suffering and damage and blood on and spilling all this blood. And in a way, like that's what 1967 is. 1967 is when the West realizes what Israel can do, and that's when the alliance truly becomes unconditional. It's when the culture of the Western culture relative to Israel and international support for Israel and everything that means in terms of transforming domestic politics too. All of that is set. It starts to be set in 1967 with the war. And the reason that it's not repeatable, including in the next round in 1973, which was not the kind of victory that's claimed whatsoever, and that I'll also be talking about in a future report. But the defeat of 1967 by, Egypt in particular being defeated in 1967 had a lot to do with their mistakes. So it wasn't just that Israel was so good, although these Arab countries, these nationalist Arab countries were not too, it's always good to remember they're not too far out of colonialism, and they may have had Soviet help, but Soviet Union was also under constant pressure and attack that eventually did collapse. And the Soviet Union was not always that great at supporting its allies, especially under Gorbachev, as I've talked about on the podcast and elsewhere. So Egypt, in particular, Jordan as well, they made some big military mistakes. And that's what enabled Israel to take these bold, brilliant moves. They made these bold, brilliant moves against their enemy that made a lot of really bad errors. What were these errors? Well, there's a paper that I was reading by a professor at a U.S. war college. He's a Middle East historian of the Combat Studies Institute, George Gawrych, Gawrych, at Leavenworth, which is an important U.S. base and college. And he says I'm going to quote this. I'm going to give you this quote at length because it's an interesting paper. It's called the Egyptian military defeat of 1967. And he says, the stunning Israeli success stemmed in part from a unique set of Egyptian failures, in large measure self-inflicted. In the 3 weeks prior to the war, the Egyptians changed their war plans, command structure, senior personnel, and troop deployments in ways that undermine the army's ability to fight against a powerful foe. Consequently, widespread confusion resulted throughout the Egyptian armed forces, so that by the eve of the conflict, the senior military leadership seemed more concerned about events in Cairo than those in Tel Aviv. In the end, Egypt's political and military leadership together unwittingly undermined unity of effort and purpose based on clearly defined war objectives. What remained for the IDF to do in order to unravel the sinews of a vulnerable senior command was to launch a bold and imaginative campaign that seized key terrain at the outset and threatened a penetration into the Egyptian operational depth. So they made all these huge changes to the way to their command, to their deployment. They had a plan for fighting in Egypt, like kind of let them come, create kill zones. They know that they have the numerical advantage. And they changed all of that. They changed all of that to a plan for kind of meeting them on the line. And then they ended up being able to pull off neither plan, right? So they changed their plans 3 weeks before. The way they changed their command was the commanders in the field, again, didn't have initiative or clear instructions, communication with one another. So there was a lot of things that went really badly wrong for Egypt so that things could go really well for Israel. Now, you can understand that coming out of a victory like that, Israel thought, well, it was a miracle. We have luck on our side. We have something special. And if you believe, as Zionism is an ideology of racial superiority, if you believe that you're the racial superiors of your neighbors, then a victory like this explains it. And this is where Israel occupied the West Bank. This is where Israel occupied the Gaza Strip. This is where Israel occupied the Sinai, the Golan Heights, all of these occupations that are still occupied today that are now under a condition of open war. Gaza's at war. The West Bank, there's fighting in the West Bank with the settlers and the settlements, and the Israeli army is there. And there's fighting now on the Golan Heights too. The Iraqi resistance is actually attacking Israel in the occupied Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights. So there's all of these areas that are under fire now, that are being fought over. They were occupied in this 1967 war. This miracle was accomplished by a set of misfortunes and mistakes by their foes. And ever since then, since the 1970s, Egypt has been a supporter of Israel, the greatest maybe supporter of Israel, especially relative to the Palestinians in Gaza. So from the biggest threat to Israel as a much bigger and frankly more powerful country, at least potentially, to the biggest supporter of Israel. And that is still now one of the pillars of why Israel is able to do everything that it does, is because of the Egyptian regime that is so seemingly unperturbable, unstoppable, and set in its desire to cooperate with Israel no matter what, and cooperate with the United States no matter what. And I want to talk a bit, because I read a couple of other books. I read Michael Oren's book, and the problem with these, they're very Israeli perspective, right? They're militarily Israeli. They're Israeli writers, Michael Oren and then Tom Segev. I read Tom Segev, which is more of a popular history, but Tom Segev in particular talks about some of the transformations that happened to Israel and Israel-American relations after 1967. He says in chapter 23, starting over the book is just called 1967, the war, Israel, the war, and the year that transformed the Middle East. But he says, Israel seemed to rediscover themselves after the war. The country was changed. What a wonderful nation we have in Iban, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, or the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Easy to mix those up. In 6 days of action, a new state of Israel was created, Iban said. Many people attributed the sudden reversal in circumstances to the victory. The victory, in turn, was associated with the newly occupied territories. Sharp decrease in unemployment. Our young people exceeded all expectations. 4,000 contracts for apartments. The war cost Israel $1 billion at 1967, which is big money in 1967, but a large portion would be recouped through foreign aid and donations. The need to re-equip the army stimulated defense manufacturing. The construction industry recovered. What else? The birth rate in 1968 was higher than the previous year. New bonds of affection between the different racial ethnic groups within Israel. So the so-called Mizrahi, who come from the Arab countries, the Ashkenazi, who come from Eastern Europe and Eastern and Western Europe. And there were divisions between them, but the war brought them together. After the war, Haaretz highlighted the role of Mizrahi soldiers in the victory and the IDF's ability to integrate them into the military. The soldiers from late immigrations fought just as well, they said. So there are still divisions, but this also, it deepened the identification between many Israeli Jews and Jews in other parts of the world. So after the war, 25% more Israeli teenagers declared the fact that I'm Jewish fulfills a very important role in my life. There was a 50% increase in the number of young people who said that the presence of Jews in Palestine in ancient times justified the establishment of the State of Israel. Twice as many respondents now agreed that almost all non-Jews are anti-Semites. 30% more young people said they're more religious than their parents. Israeli embassies abroad were flooded with requests from young professionals, mostly Jewish, who wanted to volunteer in Israel, and it was not easy to get rid of them. 22,000 people signed up to volunteer during the war, and 7,500 arrived in the 6 months after. They're volunteering to go to the kibbutzim. I think Chomsky was one of these volunteers. Maybe it was a little earlier, but I think it was around that time. So people... Israelis, here's another point. Activism on behalf of Soviet Jews was reinvigorated, and the new campaign employed the slogan, "Let my people go." Israelis observed the effects of the victory on American Jews who went through a vast spiritual awakening that was authentic and no less exciting than the one Israelis themselves had experienced, and in many cases even more profound. The Prime Minister was inundated with letters and support and checks sent by Jews from the United States and other countries, some of them made out to him personally. One man sent him his entire life savings. A worldwide fundraising drive raised $287 million by the end of September. The war had been in June. And it goes on like that. James Michener wrote a letter of love and identification with Israel, where he said he was working hard to keep attitudes here from returning to an idea of a divided Jerusalem and a divided Palestine. Barbara Tuchman, who was a historian of World War I, The Guns of August, which I used in my podcast on World War I history, she said, it may have been something this nation needs, proof to itself that submission is a thing of the past, that the ghetto is dead for good. So all of this because all of this came out of this victory. when Charles de Gaulle from France said that Israel should withdraw from the territories, end the conflict, and mutual recognition between Israel and its neighbors, freedom of navigation, solution to the refugee problem, and international rule in Jerusalem. Elie Wiesel said, one day, 2 or 3 generations from now, they will mention Charles de Gaulle and say he did a lot for his people, but he was an anti-Semite on the eve of the war. Yeah. So these so in I guess what I'm getting at is that the the total Western identification with Israel and the way that Israelis understand the world and the way that Israeli military wants to fight its wars all comes from this 1967 war. And when I come back to it, I'll try to read some more Egyptian and other Arab accounts. I've been given some recommendations, and I'm working on some getting my hands on some of those books. So I'll talk about those. But I wanted to talk about 1967 and the kind of myths, and not all myths are false or true, but like the kind of mythology around 1967 and the way that it's shaped today, and 1967 as a kind of an unprecedented, a kind of an event that was a one-off, that's not repeatable, and that everybody has learned from, and that is in a lot of ways the opposite of what is happening in this 2023, 2024 and extended war. And it's, I think, part of the reason Israel has gone so genocidal and so far off the rails has to do with the inability to conceive of not fighting, not having the victory doctrine that they expect, not being able to win everything and get their enemies to surrender like the Egyptians did in 1967. So I'll stop there. Thank you for all of your comments, your likes and subscribes. It has helped a lot. Thank you for those of you who are younger and are letting me know not to make fun of my audience of gray-haired viewers. I just so you know, it's not from nowhere. The latest YouTube analytics told me that I believe 80, I think something like 80% of my audience is over 35, or was it 45? So there is so the 10% of you that are young, thank you, and I hope you get a lot out of these videos, and we'll stop there, and we'll see what the week brings. I'm sure I'll be back in a very short time with the next sit rep.